Welcome to another Evolution Hour. In the wee hours of the morning on the 6th of May, 2024. Clickety-clack typewriters, analog clocks, and the WordPress site where there's always a ton of PDFs to download and throw at people who you want to annoy by having them read all of that stuff. Anyway, there we have our opening intro. Of course, part of the show is going through a source analysis on Titans, and we'll have a part 2 on some Ken Ham and playing off high evolution stuff and answers in Genesis. But I'm also going to be putting up a presage of a thing that's going to be like every other week. Instead of a standard part 2, a new little project has come up, which was occasioned by the debate that Dan Stern Cardinale had with Casey Luskin on junk DNA. And the position that Casey Luskin has is that junk DNA is pretty much functional, and that we'll figure that out, although Dan managed to scrape him to admit that that actually hasn't been shown yet, and that maybe a ballpark base figure of 50% Luskin would be happy with, and that took him virtually all of the debate to be able to claw that out of him. But that's not the fun little part. In the preparation for the debate, Luskin got together with Richard Sternberg and another guy, I think it was McClatchy, and developed a posting of over 800 papers that support their position on junk DNA, as though that swab is in and of itself overwhelming. Well, golly gosh, that's a lot of sources. And in fact, maybe it doesn't show what they want, which is that the majority of this junk DNA is in fact functional. So what I'll be doing is doing a source analysis on it, just like I'm doing with the Sarfati and Tay book, which will be tracking the source material down and putting up links for any of them that are open access so everybody can follow along, and analyzing in detail if the source actually makes an assertion, not that some junk DNA has function, nobody's disputing that, duh, but that most of it either will or is in fact functional. And we'll find out whether or not how much of that stuff gets plugged into that mode. Right off the bat, I noticed that at least half of the sources involved in their 800 are relating to ALU retrotransposons, which is a really dangerous area for intelligent design to go into, because there's also going to be the implications about theodicy and whether they really are wanting to say this is designed. It's just a block listing. And also I'll be cross-checking to see which ones of them are already in my reference bibliography, because those that are I'll have an indication as to whether or not an anti-evolutionist has cited them or not, to find out, therefore, how much of this material is novel, and also where are they getting some of this stuff from? Is it from little blobs of bibliographies that are lurking on the internet that they just cut and paste into a big thing? Because none of them are in alphabetical order, by the way, within their categories. And so it looks like they just kind of cobbled all of this together. So it'll be a fun little sidebar that I'll be interspersing in every other week. So what's this one for Sarfati and Tay? We're still in the theropods. We still got a few to go. Tyrannosaurs will be next week. Isn't that exciting? But the little funkies relate to Therizinosaurs. And unless you're a real dinosaur groupie, you may not be familiar with them. They're a funky, odd group of theropods that have long scythe-like claws. And as more and more analysts started looking at them, and as more fossils started to accumulate, it was looking like these were probably herbivorous. So that means that they were bucking the trend among carnivory in the standard theropod model. Now, the fun part is that Sarfati and Tay are really overstating the case regarding this herbivory matter. And So they're drawing on a couple papers from Zano's bunch from 2009 and 2011, both of which are available open access, so I'll be able to put them up. And Sarfati and Tay are concluding that the position of Zano is carnivory was more the exception than the rule. Well, not quite. They were looking at coelurosaurs, which includes Tyrannosaurs, by the way. And that also involves the avialan group that go off into Archaeopteryx and the birds. And so they're analyzing on the basis of a variety of criteria the extent to which obligatory carnivory versus occasional herbivory and other factors might be playing a part in terms of gut size and a few other factors. Perfectly fine analysts and papers. They're not of the theropods were operating in that mode, only that the little sidebars that they were dealing with had more options for herbivory than had originally been considered in times past. Another little sidebar has to do with the taxonomical squishiness of where Sarfati and Tay are saying about how they're really kind of hard to classify based on those strange appendages. But of course, that hasn't stopped meticulous analysis to be done. And both of the Zano papers have chunks of phylogeny in them in quite detail that can be compared to the nothing burger that you get in the creationist model, where in this book, they're not entirely sure that Therizinosaurs constitute a kind. They might be part of a bigger kind. Are they going to tell us on what criteria they would be deciding any of that? Of course not. They're not going to be getting around to that. I believe the Therizinosaurs are in fact treated as a separate kind and therefore family because of the systematics in the Ark encounter. But the very fact that there's a degree of squishiness going on in there, which hasn't stopped standard systematics from grouping them, it's only then they move on to figuring out what kind of biology they have. The other part, my part two, is about Ken Ham and them trotting out stuff that's just running off of golden oldies. Last April, AIG tweeted a link to a 2022 Ken Ham post. It easily evolved if you don't look closely. And I'll be putting the link up to that. It was riffing off a secondary summary of eye evolution, which also is open access, so I'll be able to put that up from 2022, which itself was basically talking about much older science papers of Gehring from 2005 that I'll be putting a link up to, and Fernald 2006. So you have an older apologetics that is being alluded to as kind of the overall conservative position that then gets riffed on by Ken Ham from that secondary account without ever bothering to look into the papers that were being discussed, let alone looking what was going on in 2022 when they were posting. So let's kind of bring them a little bit up to date. Schwab 2018 reviewed the technical literature on the evolution of eyes to much greater extent. And lots have been filled in, which naturally put the deep roots of vision systems going back very, very far, which makes them harder to identify. If all eyeballs used a single suite of genes, that would be one thing. But in fact, there's an enormous amount of diversity in the obvious cases between cephalopods and vertebrates. But that doesn't mean that we haven't learned a heck of a lot. So there was a 2015 paper by Wolf that helped clarify that. I'll be putting a link up to that because that's from PLOS, so that's open access. And then in 2021, there's a work from Chen that later helped clarify how, quote, a small family of protein kinases can recognize and be activated by hundreds of different GPCRs, which in other words is the part and parcel of how the biological systems are drawing on a suite of very ancient genes that don't start out doing the things that we see in complex eyeballs, that get co-opted in various lineages and built up to visual systems because there's an enormous selective pressure to be able to see, just as there is an enormous selective pressure to fly. Although it looks like vision systems are a more popular feature in organisms than flight characteristics. And so those are tougher to pull off. And then really tough to pull off is intelligence. And even among species that claim to be fairly intelligent, like our own, we do, after all, have Canthovian and Donald Trump. So what can I say on that? So that'll be a nice little bit. And then there's also a paper from 2014 by Yoshida, specifically about the PAX6 genes and their relations as how they played out in cephalopod eye evolution. So trying to work out, of course, what the eyeballs were in various ancient organisms and how varied these things can be when you're only looking at the genes in extant organisms and the not absolutely detailed stuff in the fossil representations. And some things can be better preserved than others. We have a little bit better sense about what's going on in trilobites, for example, because they have eye forms that are more easily fossilized than our little kind of squishy things that we find in vertebrates. So when you find the eye sockets and the rings that you find around plesiosaurs and dinosaurs and other things that show up, which indicates there was an eyeball there. But what exactly was going on in that eyeball in an organism 200-300 million years old, and what was going on in the genes of that organism, I have no way of having that directly. So it's all has to be done by retroengineering. And it's revealing that kind of synergistic connect the dots that you'll be able to see in the Schwab paper and the Wolf paper and Chen and Yoshida, interconnecting disciplines and pulling every scrap of information that you can. You can compare that to that fluff that's going on in Ken Ham level. Even the more technically minded creationists don't much past just gee whiz, saying complicated, can't be evolution, move on. And you get pretty much the same apologetics in intelligent design. Casey Luskin and others have done pieces. I won't be bothering about putting any links up onto that. But the apologetic structure that you get in that, Michael Denton and others, is very similar to the sort of apologetics that you would be getting from Answers in Genesis and ICR, except that the creationists would be putting little squibs in more explicitly about what is done by the creator, God, and rather than that kind of tiptoeing around the edges stuff that it says not Darwinism, but in terms of what sources they would be bringing up and what complaints they would be doing and what information they would not be paying attention to and what model they would not be developing is to make any sense about are any eyeballs in any organisms ever related to anything, given how broadly ranged vision is even among vertebrates or even within, say, the avian clade. There's an awful lot of evolutionary material that is lurking in the backgrounds for young Earth creationist systematics, and putatively just as much in the intelligent design framework, if they looked close enough to find out. Anyway, I'm not seeing anybody in the live chat, so may have skipped out on everybody at that point. They'll be able to catch me later on the show. So that the eyes are kind of a recurring feature. You still find people trotting out, especially at the lower internet meme level, complaints about the obligatory Darwin eye quote. That one still pops up, and I've seen Jackson Wheat point out about that on his feed that he gets. They're all addictive to that. But the actual science literature, plowing through, working out in greater and greater detail, is only going to be more interesting when it finally starts delving into paleogenomic reconstructions to work out more about vision systems and components of these, and then working more and more to figure out how the original organism structures were working out and how those were branching off. How far we'll be able to go back on that and connect the dots in relation to urbilateria and the like, we'll find out. Because I would suspect that at least some of the basement systems that are leading to vision systems have roots going way back before there are any eyeballs, and that they're doing things perhaps in novel environments that, again, paleogenomics will be working out in terms of thinking about how these things are operating in an ecosystem for which we can have no direct information because it's not going to be showing up in the fossil record. So that, I think, gets us pretty much up to speed on that. Looking at how yicky the weather has been, floods in Texas and tornadoes and all the rest. I hope any viewers of the show are in a safe environment. And if you're in these potential danger zones, well, welcome to the 21st century. This is going to be increasingly a recurring phenomenon. Just as insurance rates in Florida have been climbing from the increasing storm damages, it's likely that an awful lot of these areas that have flooding, that they didn't really have that level of trouble before. If you had storms that didn't stay put and dump rain in enormous quantity that overwhelms any drainage system that they could have in play. That's what's happening in Texas, and that's now becoming more and more frequent. And this can't help but have impact on the insurance system, given the Texans' tendency to kind of go it alone, as they've done on their electric grid, disconnected from the east and west systems, and therefore having problems when the weather overwhelms their power grid. There's going to probably be some bumpy roads ahead for them on that level. It'll be interesting to see how long the Texans can play that kind of game and without finally coming to grips to the fact that there's big consequences that they have to deal with. And the more that we delay on remedying these things at a climate change level, the more these things are going to become awkward for them. Of course, when we have disasters like that, the administration naturally pumps in right away to repair things and bring relief as to the extent possible. And that's rightly so, although I wouldn't at all be surprised that if we have another Trump administration, that there would be a certain amount of revenge financing going on, where he would try to prevent aid to any disasters in California and make sure it goes through for states that voted for him, which is exactly not what we should be doing in a system of that type. So anyway, that's what it is. We're a relatively short show then on this front. Let me put up our patrons to remind everyone that there are people who are helping the program, and to the extent that that is operational, it makes life a tad easier here in my world of our colleagues, Henry, Eric, Saris, our researchers, Ian, Convert, Steve, James, History, Paul, Gia, Ralph, Benjamin, Slava. He's like in Ukraine, and so I sure hope you're hanging in there, kid. Assistant researchers, Scott, Christopher, Lavender Lady, DM Wing, and our friends, Nana, Nielsen, Bo, Alex, and Paul, and all of our legacy patrons that have helped over the years. I'm very, very grateful for all of the folk that stick with the old RJ over all of this time. And I realize that there's, you have the dynamics of having to make ends meet in a slightly more inflationary environment, although this is trivial by comparison to what we had back in the 1970s. So you have a whole generation of people who really have never experienced anything like a serious inflation burst. We have never had a hyperinflation in the United States, and that could be catastrophic. There are quite a few countries that go into that mode. I think Argentina, I think, is currently in a ridiculously high inflation mode. And when you can get out of control into like 1,000% types, you can just vaporize what middle class you have. That's what was such a serious disruption to Germany in the 1920s that helped grease the skids for Hitler. So this issue of of how not to get onto an inflationary roller coaster is not a trivial detail. But I'll just remind everybody that Ronald Reagan was reelected in 1984 with inflation levels higher than what Biden administration is figuring. They were running in the, I think, 6 or 7% range. And this, of course, had come down substantially, cut in half, really, from what it had been in the stagflation period. So it's all a relative thing. And so I look at, a thing where they're all grumping over, well, we're only down to 2.7, or 3.2. We got to get it even lower. And I'm going, well, yeah. The other thing, of course, that if you've never had an inflationary burst, you'd realize the prices ain't ever going to go down unless you have an actual depression. You're not going to have deflation. So the whatever price levels you found, that is going to stay kind of that way. A certain level of it, as Robert Reich likes to point out, is just corporate greed, especially if you are in highly consolidated industries where they can pretty much charge whatever they want. So there's a whole bunch of issues that would involve regulatory reform and breaking up monopolies and all of that needs to be done, and that is more likely to be happening under a non-Trumpista administration and with non-Trumpistas in Congress and Senate, and as well as people on the courts who won't be declaring unconstitutional efforts. In a weird irony, apparently one of the little bits that Trump is angling to do in a second administration is to be able to do what used to be called sequestration, which is basically saying Congress appropriates money and the president just decides not to spend it. And the last president that really tried that trick was Nixon, back in the times when he was opening our World's Fair and having the trouble over Watergate. This is the 50th anniversary of our Spokane World's Fair, by the way, of which I was one of the little munchkins that went around, expo citers. I put a post up at the Faves News about my experience in that regard. But anyway, Nixon, in my view, that was one of the things that I would have thought warranted impeachment, is his attempts to impound funds that have been appropriated by Congress. It's not up to the executive to decide that. Well, Trump wants to have that kind of imperial power. Even something like pocket vetoes, line item vetoes that Clinton tried to put through, and that was declared unconstitutional. So, there's I suspect even some of the Trumpistas on the courts would be not anxious to grant such powers to the presidency. But given the weird rulings that we've had from the majority in there, I can't be certain about any of that stuff. So anyway, there was then a little sidebar on politics. We'll be putting the links into all of that stuff. And hopefully then next week, I'll launch the first of the Casey Luskin bibliography analysis. I've already looked into a few of the basic materials, and what I'm intrigued with, first of all, their bibliography is just a bibliography. It's just a vomit of sources without any commentaries or annotations or anything like that. Although Luskin has been prone to do that sort of stuff. He's been prone to these kinds of elaborate reference bibliographies. I think he was one of those that was behind the one that was put up that showed how mainstream science was supporting intelligent design, and it was a lot of stretch. But here they're diving into some very technical issues about short, repeated, and long RNCs and all that kind of stuff, and retrotransposons and all that, where it'll be the content of the paper. And they'll either sink or swim by it, and we'll give a measurement as to what variables are going on about it. So we'll be dealing with all of that in the weeks to come. And since we don't have anyone in live chat this time around, I think this is enough. I won't be blathering on any longer than this. We will put up our little advert for The Rocks Were There, and then maybe some concluding blither blather, and then we'll go for the week. Okay, and then I got to get over to oops. The old 20th century fart here, getting my media sharing going. And let us And there we are back onto the mug. We'll eventually, I imagine, have a advert when we get the second volume out of the way. And for the books and that I'm still plowing ahead on folding in the new information into the chapter that Jackson has finished and buffing up the remainder of the chapters that I've finished so far. Oh gosh, there's an awful lot of stuff in there, and we wanted to make it very, very up to date. So it's going to be a very delightful work to deal with. The one fascinating thing about young Earth creationism in particular is that it tramples on almost every venue of human inquiry. There's an overlap between the anti-Darwinism and culture camp issues about abortion and gay rights and that you'll find in intelligent design apologetics as well, because they're all, generally speaking, anti-evolutionists or very politically conservative. Long are the days since there was a William Jennings Bryan type Bernie Sanders liberal form of anti-evolutionism that was represented by Bryan, hyper-populist and all that. But young Earth creationist, because it stomps on cosmology and geochronology and all of that, is a much vaster field to deal with. And in some respects, they deserve the top dog in the creationism field as opposed to that little pimple of intelligent design, because intelligent design is mirroring elements that have been common apologetics in anti-evolution literature in that frame, have certainly been backed up into the stratosphere in the full-out creationism era. But intelligent design is way too vague to be able to develop any theoretical constructs that would ever allow them to do much of anything on that front. So anyway, that's the little bit of that. Remember, there are links to all the books, including the Paralogs of Phileas Fogg. Great fiction, wonderful historical stuff, very, very fun. And in the website, and also Patreon, a link for anybody who decides to bite the bullet and say that this old mug deserves a little squibble money from the hinterlands to help keep the project going. It is very much appreciated. So everybody stay safe, keep an eye out for wooden penguins, and we will see you next week.